Hello everyone, I'm Keanu, and now that Ahsoka is out, I'm going to rank all 16 live-action Star Wars movies and TV shows from the worst to the best. Now this is a very special franchise for so many of us, as it's the films we grew up watching that inspired our love for movies. So it's a franchise we have very strong opinions about, so remember, this is only my list, and I would love to see yours. Also consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and with that said, let's get started. In last place, we have The Rise of Skywalker, a summary of everything wrong with the sequel trilogy, and such a terrible note to end the 9-film saga on. Firstly, this movie does some of the dumbest and laziest things in the whole franchise, like bringing Palpatine back to be the main villain. But in doing so, you literally undermine the whole franchise this film is trying to close off. This means that Anakin's sacrifice was for nothing, which alone puts this movie in last place. Then you also get the introduction of a new force power that literally comes out of nowhere, just a lazy element to further the plot. And of course, the biggest issue with the sequels is that it was all unplanned, and here it is so obvious. It feels like this movie is a course correction from The Last Jedi, as things in that movie are just undone, like Rey's background, which goes in such a dumb direction in this movie. Speaking of things getting undone, even some nice character moments like C-3PO sacrificing his memory just gets undone by the end. Now it isn't unwatchable or anything. There is some Star Wars fun to be had here and there, but overall it's a mess of a film. Next up we have the Book of Boba Fett. While The Rise of Skywalker goes in some bold directions that don't work in the end, this show does absolutely nothing at all. It is easily the most generic and bland Star Wars we have ever gotten. The plot has no intrigue, no interesting threat, no payoff, no compelling characters, just nothing. And the lead character, being the fan favorite Boba Fett, is stripped away from everything fans loved about him in the first place. Instead of being a ruthless and mysterious bounty hunter with no identity, he's now a gang leader that hardly even wears his suit and basks in a tent for the majority of the runtime. Now the only reason that the show isn't in last place is that the 2 Mandalorian focused episodes are very good. But that even highlights the flaws of the show even more. The best episodes aren't even about the main character or the main plot. That brings us to Obi-Wan Kenobi, easily the most disappointing Star Wars project ever made. There were so many great directions to take the show in, but somehow they chose the least interesting version of the show possible. Now it does have its moments, like Kenobi vs Vader at the end, which was a great sequence, but that's only the last episode. The main plot is so bad, as it sort of does a rehash of the Mandalorian's main plot, but focuses way too much on unnecessary characters instead of what fans actually want to see from a Kenobi show. Then my biggest issue is that the show has terrible execution and laughably bad moments that I don't know how the studio approved of.
Almost there.
At number 13 we have The Last Jedi, one of the most divisive movies of all time. Some love it, most hate it, and it's one I slowly started to turn on more over the years. Now this movie does not get enough credit for what it does well. It has stunning cinematography and the throne room scene is awesome. But the best scene probably has to be the Yoda scene. It hits all the right notes. But then you get scenes like Leia doing Mary Poppins in space.
I'm Mary Poppins, y'all!
And of course the Canto-Bite side quest is a huge chunk of the film that goes absolutely nowhere and is basically caused by a lack of communication. Then probably the thing that bothers most is the way loot was handled, which I definitely agree with. Then we have The Phantom Menace, a movie I started to like more over the last year, and even so, it still has huge flaws. A big one is the super annoying characters like Jar Jar and even Anakin in this film, but on the other hand you get some great characters like Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. So it really is a pretty big mix of good and bad. Another big issue is just the main plot they decide to go with, which is not intriguing in the slightest, as it focuses way too much on trade routes and Senate meetings. But when you get to the good scenes they are very good, like the pod race or the final lightsaber fight. But unfortunately, the good elements are too often overshadowed by goofy moments and a boring story. Next up is Attack of the Clones. Having seen all 7 seasons of the Clone Wars earlier this year, my view on the prequels has definitely changed a lot for the better. But it still suffers from a lot of the prequel issues, especially bad dialogue in this movie, and the whole romance part of it is just terrible and one you can't buy into at all. Then there's such a big overuse of CGI, and bad CGI too, so it feels like the characters are standing in video game settings for a lot of the time. Another issue is that there's no urgency here, as the main villain is only introduced near the end, but overall I still think it's pretty enjoyable. It nails the dynamic between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and the action is also very cool, especially the big battle near the end with the clones. Speaking of the clones, this film starts off the Clone Wars, which is obviously a fan favorite time period from Star Wars. So while it has flaws, I still have fun with it. That brings us to Solo, a pretty underrated Star Wars film. Now while it is pretty forgettable and doesn't really feel necessary, I still think this movie is a blast to watch.
What's so wrong with that?
It may not have many standout moments or anything, but from beginning to the end, it's a fast-paced and exciting adventure. I think the cast is great too, and the lead actor captures a younger version of Han Solo very well. Then the villain here is also very underrated, being Dryden Voss, who is a big standout. And because of the type of plot, it feels like a western in the world of Star Wars, which can make it stand out just enough. Now the flaws the majority have are still very valid. There's really no reason for this movie to exist, but at the end of the day, I'm glad it does. At number 9 we have The Force Awakens. This used to be one of my favorite Star Wars movies, but due to the way the sequel trilogy was handled, it definitely got pushed lower down. Now this will always be a movie I have a lot of nostalgia for, as it's the first time I got to see a Star Wars movie in the cinema, so that memory will always be tied to this film. And because it follows the plot of A New Hope so closely, it also has such a nostalgic feel to it. And while it is familiar, it introduces a lot of new ideas and some interesting questions that unfortunately got very unsatisfying answers. But while it was cool to see back then, it still is a rehash of A New Hope, so it doesn't feel original at all. And I hate the way they ended Han Solo's story, and the fact that they didn't even bring the original trio together once. But this movie is still an exciting, fast-moving adventure that is entertaining to watch every time. It just didn't age as well as I would have liked. That brings us to The Mandalorian. Prior to this here, I would have had the show much higher up, as the first 2 seasons are very good, but because of the terribly mediocre season 3, I pushed it back. And what that season also did was highlight that the main issues I had with it was actually in the show all along. But that doesn't change the fact that I still really like the first 2 seasons, as it tells a unique story in Star Wars with a cool lead character, and Grogu just stealing every scene he's in. Then throughout the show, you get such a satisfying character arc for Mando, as it goes from being the ruthless bounty hunter to finally being the father figure for Grogu and returning him to the Jedi. But then you obviously get the Book of Boba Fett that undoes the season 2 finale, which means all that satisfying build-up was for nothing. Then we have Ahsoka. The latest show is a really good Star Wars project. It features everything you want from the franchise: awesome villains, Jedi, force powers, lightsaber fights, and battles. What made the original Star Wars movies so good is that George Lucas took inspiration from many different sources like Japanese samurai films, and most of the new Star Wars projects are just inspired by old Star Wars. Whereas this show borrows inspiration from Lord of the Rings as well as the fantasy genre, which can be seen in the planet designs, and even the lead character's journey mirrors that of Gandalf's. So it feels like classic Star Wars, but still feels unique at the same time. And I love how it is sort of Rebels Season 5 as it continues that story, so you get all of those characters in live action, which is very cool to see. Thrawn being a standout. Now I don't think it's that easily accessible, as you need to see all of the animated shows to understand it, so it can be a bit niche. And it feels like it just should have been live action Rebels, as the title character hardly feels like the lead character at times, but it's a very cool show and I can't wait to see the story continued. Then we have Return of the Jedi. Definitely the weakest of the original Star Wars trilogy, but this is still a very good movie and such a satisfying end. Obviously you get some awesome battle sequences and the exciting Jabba's palace rescue at the start. Then finally the showdown between Luke and Vader. Then that results in Anakin getting redeemed, which is so satisfying. Now I do think there are much more flaws in this film compared to the other 2 original movies, as they obviously didn't plan things out, so Luke and Leia being related came out of nowhere, and to this day, even though it has been solidified in canon by now, I still wish they didn't do that. And the Death Star 2 is just a rehash of A New Hope, but still a very good conclusion to the trilogy that I still think is a great Star Wars movie. That brings us to A New Hope, the movie that started it all, and to this day it's still one of the best. It does a great job of introducing the viewer to this vast galaxy far away, and obviously that comes with the introduction of the most iconic movie villain of all time. The plot itself is just a classic hero's journey that is really effective, as we see Luke go from being the farm boy to taking the path of the hero and saving the galaxy. Then the other side characters are so entertaining and so memorable, like Han Solo, Chewbacca, Leia and the droids. It's easily one of the best sets of characters in fiction. Then on that note, this movie contains one of the best scenes in cinema history, being the binary sunset scene, which is so stunning, combined with the amazing theme by John Williams. Now while it is a great movie, it is held back a bit because I think some of the scenes can feel a bit repetitive, like the final battle, but that's a very small complaint. At number 4, we have Rogue One, by far the best Disney Star Wars movie, and one that has always been one of my favorites. Firstly, this is just a beautifully made film, visually and on a story level too. There are so many stunning shots and all the action scenes are masterfully made, and honestly, this final battle might be my favorite in the whole franchise. Then it manages to introduce such a big ensemble of characters, but never feels overcrowded, and manages to make all of them interesting in their own way. And what this movie also does well is recapturing that magic of the original trilogy. And of course, we can't forget that awesome Vader scene at the end that is earned fan service. That's kind of what this film is. It's a crowd pleaser that went back to the roots of the franchise, without just rehashing it. So easily one of the best. In third place, we have Revenge of the Sith. This is a movie that I've had quite the roller coaster of feelings about. Growing up, I've always loved it and watched it so many times. Then in my high school years, I started seeing more issues in it and definitely lowered it down on my list, almost near the bottom. And now, it's once again near the top. A big reason for that is definitely watching the Clone Wars, which added so much depth to this movie. And even excluding that, I think this is such an epic ending to the prequel trilogy. It is filled with so many strong emotions, really making it a tragedy, as you see this good person go down the wrong path, first with good intentions, but then the dark side gets the best of him, which results in the most iconic movie villain being born. Then you get Palpatine, who's such a great villain in this film as well, and some awesome lightsaber battles and action scenes. It's just a really epic movie, so easily one of the best. In second place, we have Andor. Never would I have imagined a show about a side character from Rogue One would be this high on the list, but here we are. This is the best written Star Wars we have ever seen. Probably even the best acted too for that matter. Everything is so well crafted. The score, the action, characters, dialogue. The whole structure of the show is just great, as it's split up into 3-episode mini storylines, so each plotline has build-up, tension, and a satisfying climax. Some of the most triumphant and emotional moments in the whole franchise happens in this show, and the reason for that is that the show took its time to build up to these moments so they all feel earned. And after so many years and so many shows, you sort of know what you're gonna get from this franchise by now. But then you get this show that feels so unique and mature. So this series was such a big surprise, and I can't wait for season 2. In first place, we have The Empire Strikes Back. One of my favorite movies of all time that, alongside the other original movies, inspired my love for film. This is a great example of how you do a sequel that's even better than the original. It goes much deeper into the lore and explores these characters further. It also introduces some great new characters like Yoda, who is so quotable and wise.
Do or do not. There is no try.
The whole journey Luke goes on is also nicely expanded on in this film, as he trains with Yoda, then goes on to battle Vader, which ends with the most famous plot twist of all time. Then there are also so many other iconic scenes like the Battle of Hoth, which is one of the best battles in Star Wars, as well as the asteroid chase and so much more. Then John Williams elevates this movie with his great score, so not much more to say. It's one of the best movies of all time, and a height that I don't think this franchise will ever top, so it comes in at first place.